All righty. Hold on. Sorry, guys. Welcome back to the 2023 Risk Management True Quality Summit Series. I see someone's already posting where they're from. I'd love to see where everybody is joining from. Hi, Etienne. Just a brief announcement before we move forward. The Unlocking the Power of ISO 14971 for Effective Risk Management in Clinical Trials will be available later today in the Academy if you want to go check that out. This session will be covering risk management for design controls, and joining us to lead this session is Dr. Steve Coulter. He's General Manager and Subject Matter Expert at RCA. Another point to note is that if you have any questions, please use the Q&A. We'll get to as many as possible. But now I'll pass it over to Stephen to introduce himself and dive into the topic.
Good day, everybody. I'm looking to share my screen. Will you be sharing the presentation? How do I pull that up?
So you'll need to share. There should be a button next to the camera button for sharing your screen.
Got it. Thank you. Every one of these programs is a little bit different. Sorry, we got a little fouled up trying to set everything up this morning. Can everybody see my screen? Laura, can you see my screen?
Yep, we're good.
Perfect. Good morning. Glad to see you all could make it in today. We're going to be discussing a couple topics, risk management and design controls, which, there's always been questions in terms of, are they connected? Are they not connected? I run into a number of clients who struggle with this. And so we wanted to go ahead and say, how do we address these issues? What we're going to cover today, we're going to go through some basic definitions, give you some, and we're not going to try to get into detailed training on these topics. Quite the contrary, we're going to give you some reference numbers and guidance numbers that you can look up on your own. More importantly, I want to give you some pictorial presentations that help you visualize. I'm very big on using flowcharts and pictorial presentations because they make things much more clear, much easier to understand when you're talking to a variety of people. We're going to see how these two approaches, two processes either interface or don't interface. We're going to then draw some conclusions, and we will leave plenty of time at the end for some questions. So now we're going to get to what Laura commented. Who are we? Who am I? I'm a subject matter expert at Regulatory Compliance Associates. My focus is in medical devices and combination products, both the compliance, quality, and somewhat the regulatory challenges. RCA has been in operation since 2000, and we were acquired in 2021 by Sotera Health. So we are now part of the Sotera Health family. We handle all areas of life sciences. We have major branches in the quality compliance and the regulatory areas. So that's a little bit about who RCA is and who I am. And Sotera Health, here's a reference for you that you can go look us up. But basically, it's a global company that includes Nelson Labs, which many of you may have heard of, and Sterigenics and RCA. And together we're a global company helping people in safe, as our term is safeguarding global health. So let's get to what we really wanted to talk about today. We have two processes, risk management and design controls. Are they two separate processes? Are they distinct processes that point to each other? Or are they integrated processes that we have to use together? They have separate regulations. Design controls is part of the QSR, the Quality System Regulations, which is 21 CFR 820. Design controls itself is 21 CFR 820.30. No quizzes happening at the end. You don't need that. Risk management, on the other hand, is out of the ISO standards, ISO 14971. So there are different ISO standards, there are different regulations, there are many guidance documents, both from ISO and from the FDA, helping to understand both these because they're both very important processes to the development and commercialization of medical devices. So if everything's separate and they all have their own things, just how separate are they? When we take a look at design controls, let's start there. And again, I like pictorial presentations. So a quick summary of design controls talks to you about this waterfall model. And the FDA even uses this in both their regulations and in their guidance documents. They use it. It does several things. It reminds you of the different steps. It reminds you the difference between verification and validation. It also reminds you that things are sequential. Although there's iterations in here, they have to be sequential. You have to have your user needs and your inputs before you do your designing. Your outputs come after you design, and then you do verification testing and validation testing. So, this is if I had to teach design controls in one slide, you can pretty much do it from this one and just use it as a bullet point reminder to go over each topic. Likewise, let's take a look at risk management. The gold standard for risk management is ISO 14971, the 2019 version. That's the most recent version. It's the application of risk management to medical devices. Although the concepts are the same, and I don't care whether you're looking at pharmaceuticals versus devices, and you'd be looking at the ICH recommended guidance documents. I don't care if you're looking at automotive industry or aerospace industry. A lot of these topics, a lot of these comments, titles are going to be the same in place to place. They may give you slightly different instructions, directions, but they're largely the same. So again, if you go back, I'm not going to, again, go through this in detail, but it starts out by saying you're going to analyze the problem. You're going to look for the risks. Then I'm going to control the risks. I'm going to look for mitigations. And then I have a process where I put them into practice. I verify whether or not they're working. I do the iteration. I make sure that I've reduced all the risks as far as possible. So we have flow charts now that we can keep in mind, the waterfall model for the design controls and this section 4.1 flow chart that helps us understand the parts of risk management. There are lots of risk tools that are used. We're not going to sit here and have a training session in risk management. That's its own training session. It's quite involved. There's a lot to it. But there's some basic things you do that you're going to want to remember. You have to set up your risk levels and this severity chart. And this is going to be different for each product, each company. But you establish this based upon what the nature of the hazards are. So you're going to have to come up with a preliminary hazard list. And then you start looking at risk levels and this risk tolerance chart. There's another tool that I find extremely useful. There's several tools you can use, but this failure mode and effects analysis, or FMEA, or some people very casually call it FEMA, but it's really FMEA. And the whole point of this is you take a look at your design element. This one's for design FMEA. You can also create a use FMEA and even a process FMEA. And you're going to need to do this, put them all together to do your overall risk management summary. But you do that, you look at your design elements, talk about the nature of what that design is and what the failure mode is. What's the severity of that? What happens if it actually fails and you have a harm? What could cause that, and what are my mitigations for that? Excuse me. You come up with an initial rating. And so this chart is just an example. You can set yours up any way you want. And since everything was 0, these are all 0 right now. Once I start populating severity and occurrence, I'm going to get numbers. I then go back to this chart and say, was my number too high, too low? Because you will replace these with numbers in these for ranges. Then I do my mitigations, and as they've dropped, the severity never drops, but the occurrence drops. Now has that gone into the acceptable range? That is as detailed as I'm going to go into training risk management. But so long as you understand the basics, now we can talk about how risk management and design controls fit together. So our first question is, just how separate or harmonized are risk management and design controls? And at first glance, I'm going to say, the casual observer is going to say risk management it's pretty much a distinct process in the FDA's eyes. Because if I read through the CFRs and the quality system regulations and design controls, the individual sections, there's only one place, one area, and that's one line in 82030G for design validation. It says, oh, by the way, after you finish your design validation, it should also include software validation and risk analysis where appropriate. That doesn't sound real mandatory to me. It sounds pretty much like subjective, and I can talk my way out of it. So it doesn't seem like risk management is part of the CFR 820 section. But be careful, because the FDA also puts out guidance documents. And in this guidance document, they said there are two things. So these are just a couple snapshots out of it. The first thing they tell you is risk management right up here. Risk management is a systemic application of policies, procedures, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a systematic approach to reviewing, and then go back to that chart from 4.1 under ISO 14971 that had all the steps that you do in risk management. That's what they're talking about here. It's a systematic approach to the risk management process. It also does something else here in the second snapshot I said. It says right up front, it begins with the initial design input requirements. So it starts at the beginning of your design controls. Remember, your waterfall model started at the top left with user needs, which directly feed into design inputs. User needs and inputs together create your design requirements. It starts right then, and then it goes systematically through each and every step to make sure you reduce risks as necessary. So now I'm kind of thinking, well, they do interface. I'm just not clear yet how much they interface. So now what I want to do remember this waterfall model. We said, keep this in mind. Now, there's a planning stage up here. You're not even allowed to, by the FDA, you're not even allowed to get started preparing all this until you have a plan of what you're going to do. So I'm going to actually begin just before my user needs and talk about where do we get intersections between these two processes. When you're writing your design and development plan, this is required, and the level of planning is different for every product. You get a classification, you find out whether it's a class 1, low risk, class 2, medium risk, class 3, high risk medical devices. The level of risk associated with your product is going to be you're going to work with that to establish how rigorous you need to be in your plan, how detailed, because what you're trying to do is eliminate unknowns, eliminate risks all the way through. So the higher the number of risks, the more details you have to put down in your plan to make sure you've covered all these. In the planning stage, you have to take a look at all information that you have. It's not just your concept development group over there, some engineers or some marketing people that have a concept. It's much more than that. You have to take a look at all of your known information, whether it's previous designs within your company, could still be proprietary at that point, or are there published accounts of this type of device or even this class of devices that you should be drawing inferences from. All of this is going to help you understand an initial evaluation of the risk level for your product. It's not the final decision on that, but at least you get a viewpoint of just how risky your product is. So now let's get back to my waterfall model and start with the user needs. We tend to think of user needs. We say, what's the use of the product? And whether I think of the patient or whether I'm thinking of the healthcare provider, home healthcare, clinical nurse practitioner, whatever, if it could be somebody using the product on a patient or it could be the patient themselves, we tend to think of those things, direct use of it. But there are many other areas impacting user needs. Manufacturing is a user because they have to be able to make this. Regulatory affairs and quality assurance, quality control are users because they have requirements that speak to regulatory needs and to consistency needs for quality. You have consensus standards from regulators, from public health groups. So anything that has to do with the things that should be considered during your design, those are all part of your user needs. And what are they all based on? They're all failures or risks from previous designs have to be considered. So we make sure we make a good product out of this. Let's look at design inputs, the next one on our model. Now I'm going to stop and take a little bit of time here because this is a very important intersection between the two processes. ISO 14971 prioritizes the ways of doing mitigations, controls. You have to do these in order. You can't just put on labeling. So let's go through these. You have to start by trying to have an inherently safe design. If that doesn't work, or if it works partially, then what are the protective measures can you build around it? Then any residual risks that are left over, that's where I come in with labeling. And I put in its warnings, its safety alerts, its instructions for use, its training materials. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples now. Let's say my intent is to avoid unnecessary needle sticks in the hospital, because everybody knows we can pass diseases with that. So if I want to do an inherently safe design, I'd go with a needleless connector. Connectors in between IV lines and IV bags. You now have a number of needleless connectors. Twist, they break a seal, and they have open flow. That would be a design. Now, some of the features, you can't get rid of the needle. If I've got to do a venipuncture to deliver a solution intravenously, then I'm pretty much going to need a needle to get in there. So then maybe what I have to do is put a protective measure around that. Needle shield, a needle guard. So something that opens up and protects the needle when it's not actually going through the patient's skin. That way, the whoever is there, the nurse, the phlebotomist, whoever, doesn't have an exposed needle that they can stick themselves with. That would be a protective measure. The last one talks about all of your instructions, including in your IFUs, you're going to have a thing about be sure you throw this away in a sharps bin so nobody down the road can get stuck by this needle by playing around with it. So you always have to follow this. This is a clear intersection point where you can see where your inputs and your risk management are just intimately interwoven. Every risk, every potential hazard that you identify must be addressed by at least one design input. So this is a critical point. When I go from design inputs, I go through the design phase, and I've now made my products. Design outputs is the characterization and the listing of all the characteristics of my product. It's the basis of creating manufacturing specs. We do trace matrices of these to make sure the outputs match the inputs, to make sure that the use of the product in human validation trials actually match the user needs that we wanted. So these are put together, and it's an iterative process. The goal of 14971 is to reduce risks as far as possible without adversely affecting the benefit risk ratio. If you have SOPs that have different wording and may say something about as far as reduce risk as far as practical or as far as possible, some other phrases, sometimes they were just abbreviated ALARP, ALARP. Those are no longer valid. That is an old version of 14971. The new version, this is the wording. You have to keep trying to reduce the risk. But they say there is a limit. There's a benefit risk level where you say the risk is acceptable. It's never going to be zero, and the benefit of this far outweighs that. So there is a limit, but check your wording in your SOPs to make sure you're following the current version. The design verification, design validation, testing areas are intimately involved. I mean, you can't get any closer other than design inputs to the need for your risk management. Remember, your verification testing is confirming that the products, the specifications coming out of the design meet the requirements, the inputs going into the design. So I said I was going to build it this way, and I actually hit my tolerance. Within my tolerances, I hit my target. That's my verification. Design validation, not to be confused with process validation. Design validation is objective evidence that the product conforms with user needs in the intended use situation. So if you use it for something else, I can't control that. But in my intended use with my patient population, my user needs are met. I do these tests. You write plans for these. You update them. How do we figure out sample sizes? How do we figure out what tests we need to run? They're all based on risk. Each one of my design components for design verification, each one of my use steps for my design validation. So I look at my use FMEA and my design FMEA. Each one of those hazards, each one of those risks are being addressed in the tests that I'm doing in this V&V testing. Those risks, the level of risk that came from that risk table, if it was red, it's got to be dramatically reduced. If it's yellow, I got to keep trying to reduce that until it's green, but there are limits. So maybe some of the yellows are acceptable. That's what we're working on. We're looking at the overall risk of the study, the entire study, which is the entire medical device. We're also looking at the individual steps or individual components of the design. So you're looking both at the individual as well as the entire product to make sure you've reduced these risks as far as is reasonable. So these are all based upon statistics. All the statistics are based on the risk levels and your selection guides and everything. So all of your rigor in these tests are mandated coming out of your risk management plan. What about design changes? Again, I'm not going to get into detail about how much, we're going to talk about design controls versus design changes. If I do design changes before commercialization, then I'm going to handle this just through standard design controls and just do an iteration of my documentation. If I do it after I've commercialized, so after I've gone through regulatory release, after I've put it out on market, then it's going to be, again, a risk decision. You do an impact analysis by all the functional groups that are going to be impacted by this design change. And it might be a process change. So this is going to be, it could be process change or design changes. You do impact analyses by the groups that are going to be impacted. They say, is there going to be an impact on either the basic safety or performance of my product? And so quality determines whether or not there's an impact. Regulatory determines that. Manufacturing determines that. Marketing determines. Everybody determines whether or not, and you put together a design change package. And it's based upon risk and however many changes, do we need to go back and redo design verification or design validation? And again, it's all going to be risk level. The last stage that we go through on design controls are the design reviews. Well, do we do a design review on every stage, on just one stage at the end? The complexity and the novelty level of your medical device or your system, because the bigger the system, the higher the complexity. Think of these as unknowns. As a developer, unknowns scare me. Unknowns have risks that I might not have seen yet. So unknowns should be, as soon as you see something and say, I don't know, that should be a yellow flag right there to say, think about risk management. The higher the unknowns, the higher the novelty factor, the higher your risk and the more design reviews you want to do along the way to make sure things are progressing in the sequence that you want them to. So let's go back now and just to summarize, I told you I like pictures. Pictures help me visualize and they also help me teach. Take a look at my red. My red is my risk management process. My black is my design control process. So how is this impacting each one of these steps? In user needs, risk tells me I've got to take a look at known risks. I've got to review any known risk, whether it's from regulatory databases, MAUDE database, any of those. And it could be published literature. It could be my own proprietary reports from previous studies done on our products, but not commercialized yet. So any known risks have to be included. Like I mentioned a couple times, reduce all the risks possible through the designs. That's the first priority out of ISO 14971. Design it so that it's a safe design up front. So you want that. All risks must be addressed by at least one design input. Then I go through the design and development process. There are going to be a number of iterations at this phase. You're going to do some things and you go, ooh, that's opening a door to another problem. So you do an iteration. So going back and forth between your design phase and your design inputs, you're going to have a number of iterations, and you're going to be iterating your risk analysis, your determination of what your residual risk is each time you do that. It can be pretty informal, but you're going to have to remember when you get to your final design outputs, you're going to have a nice formal summary of all of your risks. Design changes we talked about, they can either be post-commercialization or part of the design development process, but they fit within that. My design outputs are where I characterize, say, I've reduced all of the final answer out of the design outputs before I hand this off to manufacturing is that I've satisfied 14971, and I've reduced all risks as far as possible, except if I violate the benefit risk ratio. Now, when I take my product, and whether I'm doing design verification to test the engineering aspects of it, or design validation and testing the use of that product, and it doesn't meet the user needs, all of these plans, all of the statistical analysis, all of my acceptance criteria, all my sampling plans are all based upon risk. And even my design reviews. How many reviews do we do? Which stages do we do them at? How detailed do they need to be? It all depends on the novelty, the level of unknowns, and the risks associated with my medical device. Okay. Time for you to talk and for me to be quiet. I will open the floor up for questions.
All right, we've got a lot of great questions here. I think the one that's getting the most attention and a lot of discussion in the chat is how do we reconcile removal of detection ranking on design FMEAs? Wouldn't having a means of detection be helpful for risk mitigation? And if so, why take detection ranking off?
Detection is usually just used on your process FMEA. In your process FMEA, if I can't see in the manufacturing process where a flaw is being built into it, that's where your detection comes in. So you don't just have occurrence and severity, which you do in the design and the use FMEAs. You now add detectability. And if it's not detectable, that escalates your risk as well. You don't do your detectability typically on your design and your use. I see almost no companies doing that. They're simply looking at the cross factor of severity and occurrence.
Awesome. So next question, is there anything that would cause a change of the initial assigned risk level? The risk controls influence residual risk, but do we ever change the initial risk level?
I think the question has to do with severity. Let me go back to that slide if I can get there real fast. Severity never changes. So when I'm doing my design elements, and you notice I don't have detectability in here because this is my process one. Severity never changes. If I go over here on the right side of my chart and I look at, okay, I did some controls and I updated, wait a minute, I only updated my occurrence. Severity is if you have a hazard and it occurred, what harm can it do? Well, either it's going to do it or it's not. My goal is to take it from a frequent or even somewhat frequent to doesn't happen very often at all. That's what we're doing in risk controls. You never change your severity, you only change your occurrence.
Next question is, what are some acceptable methods for verifying risk controls which were implemented through inherently safe design?
Okay, I'm trying to think that question through. Okay, so an inherently safe design, I'm going to go back and I'm going to take a look at my design elements. So by the time I iterate my design and I say, okay, I'm going to go from needle guard. So I have a bare needle in the example I use, and that has a risk that I could get needle stick. Well, maybe I put a needle guard on there. Well, the needle guard has its own design elements. It's got a spring. It's got the length of the plastic that's got to cover it. So it has other design elements. So I think what ends up happening is once I make design changes, I have to go back and revisit this whole column on design elements because my product has changed. And if I go now to a needleless system, so there are no needles, well, then it would be a complete change. So I think you have to take a look at the level of change on trying to make a risk mitigated design up front and wait until you do your final design FMEA on the final option. I hope that answers the question.
Okay, hold on, let me. Okay, here's a good question. Where do you define product abuse that is likely to happen? It may be that the handheld device is dropped on the floor or comes into contact with hand lotion or something like that. So I'm guessing that's foreseeable.
I got it.
Reasonable.
No, I got it. And you also have to, so you have to address use, intended use, reasonable use, and reasonable misuse of your device. So dropping it is an obvious, misuse, but it was an accident. But you also, if you actually know of somebody who, they've even written papers say, look, it's not approved for this, but I'm a surgeon. I can do what I want. And they publish a paper saying, I use this device on my own decision for a completely different intended use. If you're aware of those, they all go into your use FMEA. I like to do my use FMEAs by starting out with a storyboard. So think in terms of cartoon panels, and the product comes in, I unpackage it, I can read the labels, I can do all the visual checks that I want, I make sure my product isn't expired. So there are all sorts of things I do up front. I then go to prepare it for use. I then use it. I then go all the way through disposal of it. So I storyboard everything. Now, anywhere that there's chances for something to go wrong, I have a little diversion, like a little trail going off into another whoops. And on that diversion, put in the steps that could affect or create new hazards due to the unexpected misuse or the actual intended misuse, intended reasonable misuse. If somebody decides to use your colonoscope to hammer in nails and breaks it, I can't control that. And that's not a reasonable misuse. So there are things you can, have to take into consideration. There are other things you can say, that's not reasonable. So they would go into my storyboarding for my use FMEA, and I have to consider all those little trails that might take me into a different use hazard, I have to make sure they're all captured in my risks.
All right, here's a kind of a structure question. When a potential failure mode has multiple possible harms of various severity levels and occurrences, do you create separate rows on the matrix for each harm?
I do not. There are several ways to handle it. If I have several, get my mouse here. If I have a design element, and this could be a use element as well, and I have different failure modes, and each one of those failure modes has a hazard. Now, this hazard, and my mouse isn't working. The hazard from my preliminary hazard list has an assigned severity. And if it's, a bleeding, a biocompatibility, and an infection, pretty high severity. If it's underdose or overdose, it depends on what your drug is on a combination product. So it may not be anything more than a moderate. In that box, if I have several failure modes and causes for those failure modes, I always take the worst severity and go forward from the worst. So I might have a severity of a 5, a 3, and a 2 in there. I note that someplace else, and notes are someplace else, but then I keep 5 here, the worst severity for each one of these. I like to keep them all in the same line because it was that design element that had different potentials. So I simply do carriage user unit and maybe do an A, B, C under here, A, B, C, and then just put in B as the highest 5, something like that.
Okay. Next question is, I believe it's asking about addressing risk management with design changes to your software medical device.
Try to make sure I understand the question. Software as a medical device. Now, I'm not trying to slight any of our wonderful software engineers. It's just another device. It's different because the way we design them and the way you have a certain level of bugs, every time you go through iterations, you're constantly coming up with more things that need to be done. Software is not as stable as many other medical devices. It's a very dynamic thing, and you're always learning, you're always improving. But it's simply another medical device, and you're going to do all the same steps in here for each one of those changes. Remember to do your impact analysis in part, but the biggest failure of 95, 98% of the companies out there is they do the change analysis or the impact analysis in part, but they don't go back and say, but what's the impact analysis in total for the software? If I change one aspect and everything is tied together with cogs and gears, what else did that change in my software program? Did I create bugs someplace else? You have to do in part and in total. And that's the only real big difference with software as a medical device. Other than that, I try to treat it just the exact same way as I would treat a pre-filled syringe or a wound dressing.
I have a good question here. At what point does post-market surveillance trigger an update to the risk management file? Breach of occurrence rate, breach of severity, unanticipated harm or failure, other?
Yes. You have to write into your risk management plan. You will define what triggers an update. All of these, and in your executive management review procedure, they will put down thresholds, not only for you remember we have an occurrence column here. So you can equate that to the frequency of complaints. And if all of a sudden you have complaints start spiking, And some people do it by the threshold of spike. Some people do it by saying it not only has to spike, but the spike has to be maintained 3 months in a row, something like that. That would trigger typically a kappa. And as soon as you open up a kappa, you're going to be going back in, and the risk management file must be readdressed to make sure it's still current. Was this something identifiable that you turn around, put the clamps on, and it goes away? Or did it raise issues with either use or design that I have to go change? And if I make a change to my product, then I'm in change control. And again, I'm doing my impact analysis. So your management reviews, your quality reviews, and your risk management plans for that individual product all should be giving you triggers for what my threshold is for reconsidering this. If you cross that threshold, you typically, I'm using typically, not must and always, open a kappa. And the end of a kappa process is almost always to go back and revisit your risk management file, make sure it's still valid.
And another question here. When a new version is developed, and I guess new version of the product is developed and the risk matrix is updated, do you start from the previous calculated risk, residual risk, or do you calculate everything from scratch?
That's up to you. To the extent, I mean, why wouldn't you leverage something that you already have? So why wouldn't you? So, I mean, I hate throwing away good data that you already have. You've got to revisit each one to make sure it's still valid. But I have no problem starting with the old one. But it's kind of, remember, it's kind of like what I was talking about with software as a medical device. You've got to do it in part and in total, because it kind of depends on how integral that one change was to the safety or performance of the rest of the device.
I think we're coming close on time. We've got about 2 minutes left, but I would like to thank you, Steve, for the great presentation. For everybody attending, we'll send a follow-up email later today with access to the recordings and any certificates. And we wish everybody the best. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much.
Okay.